On the outskirts of town, where the houses stood empty and the asphalt had long since cracked, there was an old courtyard. It had long been abandoned, and children from the nearby neighborhoods didn't dare to go there. But rumors about it passed from mouth to mouth. It was said that there was a huge Ferris wheel in this yard that seemed to defy time and wind. No one knew who built it or when. It was just there, a huge, black silhouette against the sunset, like a ghost of the past. For teenagers, the place was both frightening and tantalizing. Everyone dreamed of going there, but few dared. All that changed when 16-year-old Oskar heard about the old courtyard. He was not a timid boy. He liked to take risks and prove to others that he wasn't afraid of anything. "It's just an old tire," he told his friends. "What are you so afraid of?" "It shows the future," replied Emma, his neighbor. Her voice trembled, as if she was already imagining what she might see. "But if you see too much, your future becomes a nightmare." "Nonsense." Oskar grinned, but interest flashed in his eyes. "I'll go there and prove to you that they're just stories." That evening, as the sun sank into the purple clouds, Oskar went to the courtyard. The grass was dry and the air smelled of dampness and dust, as if the courtyard itself had long since forgotten what life was. The boy's footsteps echoed, and every crack of a branch under his feet sounded like a gunshot. When he saw the wheel, his heart sank. It was huge, even bigger than he could have imagined. The metal spokes stretched upward, reflecting the last rays of the setting sun, and the cab swayed in the wind, making a faint creaking sound. It was as if the wheel was calling to him. It was quiet all around. Too quiet. No birds, no insects, just a cold wind that seemed alive. Oskar inhaled deeply, feeling the air fill his lungs with a mixture of rust, dampness, and some elusive scent reminiscent of old books. "Nothing much," he muttered, but his voice sounded uncertain. Oskar walked over to the wheel and looked at one of the cabins. It was covered in a thin layer of dust, but the inside was clean, as if someone had recently wiped it down. He sat inside, closing the door behind him. The metal beneath him was cool, and it felt strangely comforting to him. Suddenly the wheel squeaked. It began to move on its own, without any electricity, without levers. Oskar felt his cabin slowly rise upward. His heart beat faster. When he was at the top, the world around him changed. There was no old courtyard below, only a vast glowing city. Its lights twinkled like stars, and the air was warm, smelling of fresh flowers. Oskar stared at it, breathless. This wasn't his city. This was the future. He saw himself, older, more confident, with a smile on his face. He stood on the stage and the crowd of people applauded him. His words sounded loud, confident. He was someone of significance. This future was exciting, and Oskar felt proud. But suddenly the picture began to change. People in the crowd began to fade away. The applause was replaced by silence. The stage darkened, and the face Oskar had seen distorted in horror. Now he stood alone, surrounded by darkness. His hands trembled and fear was in his eyes. "No," he whispered, trying to distract himself. This couldn't be true. The wheel had stopped. It brought him back to the ground, but Oskar's heart was beating like he had just run a marathon. Oskar returned home, but now there was a void in his mind. He couldn't forget what he had seen. First the dream and then the nightmare. It seemed to him that the darkness surrounding him in the future still followed him. He tried to tell his friends, but they only laughed. "You're making it up," they said. "It's just an old toy." But Oskar knew it was true. He could feel something had changed. The future he saw was not just a possibility. It was a reality that was beginning to come true. His fear grew and his nightmares became more vivid. A week later, when the night was particularly dark, Oskar went to the wheel again. He decided he had to make a change. He thought that if he sat on the wheel one more time, he could rewrite his future. The yard greeted him with a cold wind and the same oppressive silence. The wheel seemed to be waiting for him. Oskar got into the cab, and it began to climb again. This time it was different. All he saw was darkness. No lights, no future. Just endless darkness that whispered something to him in an unknown language. His body trembled and his heart beat so hard that it felt like it might burst. When the wheel stopped, Oskar was no longer the same. He stepped out of the cab, but there was no longer any light in his eyes. His friends found him the next day, sitting on the edge of the yard. He didn't speak. He only whispered, "I've seen too much." During the night, Oskar woke up to the sensation of something pulling him back to the wheel. His body felt as if it was exhausted, but there was a faint whisper in his head. "Come back," a voice whispered, as if it came from within his mind. "You didn't see everything." His hands shook as he sat up on the bed. The air seemed thick with the odor of metal and damp, just like the old courtyard. He realized it was not his thoughts. It was not his desire. But something he saw was pulling him back. "I can't," he whispered to himself, but the voice in his head was insistent. "You have to find out the truth." Oskar walked through the dark streets as if in a dream. The city was empty, and every step he took echoed deafeningly. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees, and in this rustle he heard words he could not make out. As he approached the courtyard, terror gripped him. The Ferris wheel, which had previously looked abandoned, was now glowing. Its spokes shone bright silver, and the cabin slowly rocked, making a metallic creaking sound. It seemed to be waiting. Oskar took a step forward, feeling the cold wind embrace him, snaking under his clothes. The ground beneath his feet was solid, but there was a strange scattering of white and black grains of sand, as if someone had spilled someone's dreams there. "It's all just an illusion," he whispered, shivering. "I must understand." His legs carried him to the cabin. When he sat down, the wheel creaked as it began to move. It moved faster this time, and Oskar's heart beat in time with the rotations. As the cabin rose to the top, a completely different world opened up before Oskar. It was neither future nor present. He was in some empty space where light was replaced by darkness at an incredible speed. A strange heaviness enveloped his body, and the air was filled with the smell of bitter herbs and cold rust. Suddenly images began to appear before him. He saw himself on the stage again, but this time the people in the crowd were faceless. Their bodies moved like marionettes and the applause sounded like hammer blows. Oskar felt his chest clench with terror. His heart screamed, "This is wrong. This is not my future," he shouted. "What is it?" The voice in his head answered. "This is what you wished for. But you didn't realize that wishes have a price." The images changed. Now he saw his family. His parents stood in an empty house, their faces haggard, their eyes full of tears. His sister, the one he had always protected, called his name, but her voice sounded like an echo in the void. "You chose this," the voice continued. "You wanted to know too much, and now that knowledge is devouring you." Oskar tried to turn away, to close his eyes, but the images continued to haunt him. They were everywhere, as if they were ingrained in his mind. Every movement he made seemed futile. "I want to get out," he shouted, his voice trembling. "You can't get out until you understand what it means to see your future," the voice replied. "You're looking for answers, but you're afraid of the truth. It's a trap," he shouted. "You want to leave me here. You came here on your own," replied the voice, louder now. "The wheel is only a reflection of yourself." Oskar felt the cold penetrate deeper into his heart. His body trembled and tears ran down his cheeks. He suddenly realized, every decision, every wish, every dream has consequences. And the urge to look beyond the limits of what is permissible takes not only strength, but also the very soul. The wheel began to move again, bringing Oskar back to earth. He sat in the cabin, his body seeming light, almost weightless. When the cab stopped, he didn't immediately dare to get out. But finally, gathering the rest of his strength, he stood up. When he turned around, the wheel was as still as if it had never moved. The light was gone, and once again there was an oppressive silence. Oskar left the courtyard, but the feeling that he had left a part of himself there never left him. Every step he took was soaked with fatigue, but he knew one thing: he would never come back here again. Since then, Oskar had become different. He no longer sought risk or tried to prove his courage. His eyes were full of emptiness and his smile was gone forever. His friends never saw him the same again, but no one dared to ask him what had happened. The only thing he said once to Emma, who dared to speak after all: "Some things are better not to know. Sometimes not knowing is all we have." Those words stayed with her forever. And when someone once again talked about the wheel in the old yard, Emma only whispered, "It will show you everything. But it will take more than you can give." Why do you think Oskar changed after his ride on the wheel? Would you dare to see your future? Write your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to our channel to hear more stories that leave a mark in your soul and make you think.